I get now to introduce Jonathan Mitchell, our keynote speaker. And part of the reason we always have a keynote speaker is so I don't have to follow the students after they share, because they're always fantastic. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to get to know Jonathan Mitchell. I would say that he's probably the least known of the Mitchell family here on our campus. And I was talking to Kate a little bit today, and I actually need to be corrected on that, because as Kate and I talked, she started talking about their oldest son, Dan, who until today I didn't know existed, which I don't know if that says more to me about as a boss or Kate, or we laughed about that. And she's like, when they don't come to your school, you just don't, you came here late. So I don't know Dan, but Dan's a Wheaton graduate, doing great things. You might know Ian, who graduated in 2017. Their other son, who is at Covenant College, was very involved in cross country and a number of other things here at the school. You may know Sarah, who is a freshman. An absolute cross-country phenom who I think set or broke all kinds of middle school records, and again, just a delightful child to be around. And Jonathan, who is our speaker tonight, I know you've got a bio in your program, but I didn't know Jonathan until about 2 years ago, and when I had the opportunity to meet him, I think it was Dana Morrison who told me, you really need to sit down and talk to this guy. He's really interesting. And I was like, all right. And I still didn't really know what I was getting into. And then as I sat there and talked to him and got to know him a little bit, I realized, how do I know this guy? And what I came to was, he's basically Indiana Jones if Indiana Jones wasn't an archaeologist and had been like a techie business guy. That's Jonathan Mitchell. And if you doubt that, just wait until you hear some of the stories and pictures and things like that. He is an amazing example of what God can do in a life when you decide to be all in. And when you decide that with you and your commitment, you're going to follow God's lead wherever that might take you. And for him, it's quite literally taking him around the world, as next year he will assume the presidency of a college in Lahore, Pakistan. Which again, sounds as a pretty daunting task, but I know that God has called him to that. And as he shares a little bit about his story, again, I know you will be blessed. I do want to mention, just apologize in advance for the long commute that Kate's going to have next year, and Sarah, and I know that they'll run up those frequent flyer miles for you quickly. But if you would please, everyone, welcome Jonathan Mitchell.
Thank you, Eric. Well, maybe if you've read my bio, you might know that I grew up in Pakistan, so in some ways, I'm going home. And I saw God work in some really remarkable ways through the testimony and life of my parents. And they were people who totally gave their lives to what God was doing. They held nothing back. They really were all in. And I found myself working professionally after coming back to college here in the States. I found myself working professionally in Pakistan. I'm really glad I did, because that's where I met Kate, my wife. And in case you don't know, she's the lovely lady with a British accent who mans the front desk at the upper campus. And she's also the one that sends you all those tardy and absent notices. So most of you have probably received an email from her. But in Pakistan, we had the chance to do some really remarkable things, and I forgot the clicker for the slides, if someone could bring that to me. We had a chance to do some really remarkable things. One of the most exciting ones when we worked up in the very far north in Pakistan, up in a place called Gilgit, I managed 180 girls' schools for the Aga Khan Development Network. Do we have that clicker handy? Oh, we got that up there. If there's a way that I could move those myself, that would be great. There were 28,000 girls in those, spread out over 25,000 square miles. We had 2 helicopters to take us around. And why do we have 2 helicopters? Because this is where the tallest mountains in the world all come together: the Himalayas, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, and the Pamir Mountains. And after 9/11, I was asked by the U.S. State Department to become their senior advisor for education in Pakistan. And I had the next year to spend 100 million of your tax dollars. I've got a lot of stories that I could tell you about that as well. But Kate had said that before I launch into what I'm going to tell you about tonight, I ought to give you a little bit of a sense, well, let me back up just a little bit, of what Pakistan looks like. It is a Muslim country, 98% Muslim. There's a very small Christian minority there, and a very fledgling church, which is often persecuted, and often they're in the news as being, used these blasphemy laws against them and so on. And so a mosque is a rather similar image of what Pakistan looks like. But a lot of people don't know that it's got some of the most spectacular scenery in the world. This is with my son Ian and my son Dan. Back in 2013, we went back to show them some of the places they'd grown up. And we're up at about 16,500 feet here, but we could still go another 2.5 miles higher and still be on ground. Some of the tallest mountains in the world, and absolutely spectacular. It is spectacularly beautiful, and it's a place that I really enjoy being from, and it's part of my identity there. You also ought to know that if you don't want to climb mountains, you don't want to ride anywhere, you can get a lot of thrills, maybe even more than Disneyland, by some of the roads. That is my old Land Cruiser that I restored, and it's 4 inches wider than the road we are on. That's just stacked shale, and if you want to get a closer view, that's what it looks like. And so if you need a little bit of adrenaline, they got plenty of that for you as well. But this is what some of the bridges looked like that we had to cross to get some of the schools. And that is my lovely wife, Kate, standing right there. And that is Daniel. I don't know why we let him stand up there. But anyway, I sent this picture to Eric had asked if I had any pictures I wanted to put up. And I said, well, what do you think of this one? And he said, there's no way I'd ever step onto that bridge. And I said, well, yeah, you got to be all in. And of course, maybe that's what he was afraid of. That water is cold. So anyway, so there's a lot of exciting things, but there you don't even know 2% of how adventuresome my wife is. And she blends in rather well too. This is with a group of mothers who's the first generation of women who were getting an education, the daughters of these women here, and that's Kate with them. And Kate also just has a really remarkable way of entering into other people's lives and communicating with them. So as we move back to Pakistan, we do this together, and it's something that we're quite excited about. But some of you may not know that in 2002, this was after 9/11, we were in a church that was attacked by a suicide bomber. And that changed our lives in a lot of ways. My wife almost died in that incident. And the U.S. government would no longer allow my family to be with us. And so we got tired of being separated. She was based in the U.K. for a while. And so we decided to come back to the States. We had no idea what we were going to do. But I ended up being invited by RTI International to join their international development group. And before I knew it, I was using the skills I developed in Pakistan, in Indonesia, and Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, and Malawi, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, different places like that. And wherever I'd go, I'd look and see what local Christian ministries were doing. And I rapidly became quite distressed at what I felt were well-intentioned but ineffective efforts to make a difference in the lives of the poor. So I started advising and serving on boards sort of in my spare time. And exactly 8 years and 1 day ago, my wife and I took a big step of faith, one that really required going all in. A good friend of mine had come into my office, a guy named Henry Kastner. He's one of the co-founders of bandwidth.com, if you follow that. He came into my office one day and he said, Jonathan, you have this remarkable set of skills. And I know you do a little bit of advising and helping Christian ministries on the side, but, he said, I've been praying about it. My wife and I want to encourage you and your wife to start a nonprofit and do that full time, to use your skills to increase the effectiveness of Christian ministries anywhere in the world, whether they have the ability to pay you or not. And this was in the middle of the biggest recession since the Great Depression. And I thought, man, that's going to be a pretty scary thing to start a nonprofit and try to raise funds for something like that. But on the other hand, we had a really deep sense of call. And in my mind, there was this niggle that, okay, I could stay at RTI International. It's comfortable. It's a great group of people to work with. I love my work. But I would always wonder what would have happened if we'd taken the plunge and tried that. And I didn't want to live with that question. And so before we knew it, I'd quit my job, and we had launched, we choose a sort of a neutral name called Concentric Development, focused on partnering with Christian ministries and helping them achieve more with the resources that God has blessed them with. So the story I'm about to tell you in the next 10 or 15 minutes is a real testament to God's faithfulness and the limitless blessing that he gives and pours out when we step out in faith in response to his call, when we are all in. But one thing I've come to discover is that while many of us think we trust God, in reality, we're really terrified of being dependent on him. We have this illusion that everything that we have and everything that we've accomplished are really the deserved fruit of our own efforts and our strengths and our abilities, but that really is an illusion. If you get laid off or you get a cancer diagnosis tomorrow, that would put most of us into just real fits of overpowering anxiety. And all of a sudden, we'd be uncertain of the outcome and not certain of the effectiveness of our efforts to change that. And it's a place that most of us don't want to be. But over the last 10 years, and particularly since starting Concentric Development, Kate and I have really discovered the incomparable richness of being all in and of being dependent on God for everything, for the resources that come in, for the safety when I am traveling, for favor with the people that I work with, all these things. And we've recognized and we've come to realize in a deep way the beauty of focusing on taking small steps in faith and in obedience and letting God work out the things that seem impossible to us. And it really is true that we serve a God who's able to do immeasurably more than anything we could ask or imagine. But it does require a willingness to be all in and to hold nothing back and to take God as his word. And the result for us has been one of the most rewarding, not one of the most, but definitely the most rewarding, exhilarating, and fulfilling things that we've ever experienced. And I'd like to share two little quotes before I share our story. The first one is from one of my uncles who's an NBA coach, and I love what he said. He said, "Too many of us forget that God's house is a mansion, and we content ourselves by getting stuck and living our lives in the doorway with one foot in and one foot out. And we never get to experience the whole mansion." The other quote that I have here, this is my own, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway. "When we resist the Holy Spirit's prompting out of fear, not only are we being disobedient, but we rob ourselves of the opportunity to watch God provide for us and do unimaginable things through us. And we rob ourselves of the stories that we could tell of what God's done." And I get to tell a story tonight, and that's exciting for me. And I want to share with you just some of the graces and favors that God has showered on us as a result of being all in. When we started Concentric Development, I started doing quite a bit of work in India. And I was just really stunned by the difference between Pakistan and India. India is awash in resources for Christian endeavor. There are thousands of Christian ministries, and they've all got linkages with churches here in the States. There's short-term missions trips going back and forth, and people are really engaged in India. In Pakistan, most of the Western missionaries left. It even started before 9/11, but after 9/11, security and even permission to be in the country really went down. And with them went a lot of the relationships with the churches and the foundations and the individuals that supported the work. And the church in Pakistan is not a wealthy church, and they've suffered through centuries of persecution and discrimination, and they really, really struggle. And yet they are really committed to reaching that country for Christ. But the lack of resources really constrains their ability to cast a bold vision. And I remember talking to some of my friends there in Pakistan. I said, well, what can we do about this? And even people who would want to give to Christian work in Pakistan don't know who to give to. And it's difficult for them to go visit, and it's difficult to hear about what God is doing. And we said, you know what, we need a ministry fund for Pakistan. A fund that would set priorities for the country and develop strategies for reaching that country for Christ, and which people could give to in full confidence, knowing that those resources would be used for the purpose intended and would be used effectively. But how do you get from the idea of starting a ministry fund to actually doing one? So I started doing a little bit of research in this, and I discovered that there are other ministry funds. It's not a unique idea. But all of the ones that I discovered were started by the people who had the resources. They were started by what I call kingdom investors. These were the people that had the money. They weren't started by the people who needed the money, and there's a reason for that. You need some resources to think through how a ministry fund is going to work. You got to mobilize the ministries in the country that you're going to invest in. And you need to mobilize the donors and put together sort of marketing materials and whatnot so people know all about this. And no one's going to give you a grant to think about doing something that hasn't been done before, which may or may not come into being and be fruitful, or whose structure you haven't figured out, and for which you don't know whether anyone else might invest in. Besides, I was an unknown quantity. I'd grown up overseas. I didn't know a lot of people here in the States, and I didn't have my own resources to invest. Not only that, I didn't have a track record of starting ministry funds. So what confidence would anyone have that, Jonathan Mitchell can pull this off? And people were skeptical about Pakistan. The church there has a history of not always using resources very effectively, and sometimes ministries there don't cooperate very well with each other. I also didn't know any wealthy individuals. So how are you going to get started on something like this? It looks pretty hopeless. Well, I have a friend down at the Chalmers Center. I don't know if you've read the book When Helping Hurts, but a guy named Brian Fickert. Some really beautiful perspectives on how to give effectively. He was in Togo in West Africa, and our email exchange, he came to know that I was going to be in Ghana at the same time. And these are neighboring countries. And he said, well, why don't you pop over and say hi and see some of what we're doing in Togo. And it's only a 4-hour drive, and I'd never been to Togo. And I'd always, seen that on the map when I was a little kid, and I thought, I had to memorize the capital, since that was the one that I knew. And so I went and visited him, and he had a group of people with him, and he introduced me and said, well, Jonathan, tell them just a little bit about what you do. And I said, well, we as the church are very generous around the world. People give very generously to Christian work around the world. And my job is to increase the value of everybody's gift, to help those dollars achieve a lot more and increase the effectiveness of the organizations that receive those money. The problem isn't that people don't give enough. The problem is those resources aren't often used as effectively as they could be. And there was a guy named Andy Weigel, said, could you put me on your mailing list and could you give me a copy of your card? And so I gave it to him. I didn't think much more about it. Well, 10 days later, we had put in a grant request for me to work with one of the organizations in Pakistan, the Pak Mission Society, which has the catchy acronym PMS. And so we put in a grant request to a foundation on the West Coast for me to work with them to strengthen some of their internal systems. And so they gave us $30,000, but that was dependent on us getting another $30,000 matching gift. And so I thought, man, now we got to raise another $30,000. And we were just sending out a prayer letter. And in the last little bullet point on the prayer request, I said, yeah, and could you please pray that we're able to raise these matching funds for $30,000. So I was there on MailChimp, and I hit the send, and it goes out to about 600 or so people who receive our newsletter. And I don't think it was more than 3 minutes, and my phone rings. And Andy Weigel's on the phone. And he said, I just saw your newsletter. And he said, my wife and I would like to contribute that $30,000. I thought, well, wow, that didn't take very long. I said, well, if you're going to invest in Pakistan, I really think that, you need to come out there and see what God is doing. So he said, sure, I'll come with you. And we went out for about 2 weeks, and I took him all over, and we met a lot of the people. And he's done a lot of work in the Middle East. He's an experienced kingdom investor. And he was just really excited by what God was doing there. And when we got back, he sent me a letter saying, these are all the things I saw in Pakistan. This is what makes me think it's just really an amazing investment opportunity. And I'm committing $300,000 over the next 3 years to help you start this ministry fund. I thought, wow, we've got the money, but I don't know how to start a ministry fund. And so as I started talking to people that this is something we wanted to do, one of the questions they would ask is, what would your priorities be? Now, I had my own ideas about what the priorities of the fund ought to be, but I don't know everything that God's doing in Pakistan. And I thought, well, maybe we need a landscape study. Let's talk to a lot of Christian leaders around the country and find out, what are the challenges that you as a church face, and what are the opportunities that are in front of you as a church here in Pakistan. And so we started this, and as we talked to people, it was like we'd opened a tap. It was just like opening a fire hydrant where people couldn't stop talking. not only about the challenges that they face, but also about the opportunities before them. And as people would talk, they would say, you know, a lot of these challenges have been there for a long time. Maybe this is the time for us to start addressing some of these weaknesses within the leadership of the church and some of the challenges that the church has faced over a long time. Maybe this is the time. And over a period of about 6 months, this groundswell of anticipation began to develop in the church nationally that this is the time. This is the time. Now, we launched this study and we had a big national launch of it, and we got it published, we've got a video on it, and people were very excited about it. But I didn't know how this study was going to help us launch the fund. Well, it didn't take very long where people began to hear that, oh, you know, Jonathan Mitchell has sort of led this interesting landscape study in Pakistan. So I started getting calls from people saying, hey, when can you give us a briefing on this? So finally I said, look, let's do something in Chicago. So in April of 2017, we flew in a few Pakistanis who'd been involved with the study, and about 15 or so Kingdom investors showed up to hear what was going on in Pakistan. So we told them about it. We told them what we'd found in the landscape study, and we shared our vision for a ministry fund. And they said, well, when do you want to start this thing? I said, well, in January of 2018. That's 7 months from now. The next question was, well, what do you need between now and then? Well, I'd done a little bit of homework. We needed $132,000. And so they said, well, give us a few minutes. So they went off into a huddle and came back. They said, you've got it. We didn't have to write a proposal. We didn't even give them a detailed budget. We just stated the figure, and they said, you've got it. Well, that enabled us to bring about 30 Pakistanis to Dubai and about 15 foundation heads and Kingdom investors to talk about what would a fund look like, what would the priorities be, how would it be structured. And we'd put together a first-year budget of $600,000, which include grants to ministries and a lot of capacity building. And we'd set a target of $5 million a year within 5 years. So we were going to ramp this up pretty quickly. And I had no idea where the resources were going to come from. Within 3 days at that conference, I hadn't even talked to anybody asking them to commit anything. They came forward to us with commitments of $550,000 of that $600,000. I didn't even have to raise any of those funds. We had all those resources right there, and we were able to launch in January of 2018. And the amazing thing is, we'd only used half of Andy Weigel's original pledge of $300,000. We still had half of that left. It was just like that little widow's oil, just never ran out. But let me pause now and tell you about something else that was going on behind the scenes. It's 2.5 years now ago, I was visiting Foreman Christian College in Lahore. This is an amazing institution that was started in 1864 by a Presbyterian missionary, Charles Foreman. And it has had an outsized influence on that part of the world. And it's amazing that a Christian institution can exist in the way that it does. 2 Indian prime ministers, 2 Pakistani presidents are alumni of that university. Sir Arthur Compton, Nobel Prize winner in physics, did his Nobel Prize winning research in cosmic rays at Foreman Christian College. He was part of the physics department there. It's got a really remarkable history and is a household name in Pakistan. It's 8,000 students all the way up to PhD level, very strong in the sciences, very highly regarded. And I had been talking to them about a leadership development program and developing a program in leadership. And the president called me aside and he said, well, you know, I'm going to be retiring in 2019. Would you consider being the next president? I thought, man, my parents are getting older. I've got a teenage daughter. It was a great place to grow up as a boy, but I don't know about a teenage daughter in this Muslim country. And besides, you know, I'm really busy with this ministry fund that we're going, really happy with what we're doing. I said, I'm willing to pray about it. And I didn't really give it much more of a thought. Well, my parents were getting older, and we talked about finding a retirement place for them, and they got into the queue. There was a 2-year wait for a retirement community, and within 2 months, suddenly they said, there's a place. And I thought, wow, that's one problem off the table. So at that point, I sort of felt comfortable telling Kate that he'd asked me to think about this, and I thought she's going to have a heart attack taking her back to Pakistan again. And it immediately was clear to us that, you know, unless we take Kate and Sarah had never been, she was born after we left, and we can be satisfied and convinced that they could thrive there, it's not something I would even think about. So in March of 2017, we took Sarah out. Kate hadn't been back since the church bombing, and that was a bit of a traumatic departure when we left. So we had no idea how this was going to go. And, you know, Sarah was sort of taking everything in. She didn't say a whole lot for the first few days. At the end of the first week, she said, Dad, you know, do you think we could move here? This place is awesome. I thought, wow, out of the mouth of babes, right? And suddenly, one of the other big concerns was out of the way. But the big thing that remained in my mind is this ministry fund is just getting off the ground. And I'm the interface between the kingdom investors here and the ministry leaders in Pakistan. What'll happen if I leave? How are we going to keep this thing going? I didn't know how that was going to work. And so I talked to some of the Pakistani leadership and I said, what do you think? And they said, wow, if you could come and be at FC College, that would be such a shot in the arm for the church here. Absolutely, you need to take that. God is going to figure out how to keep this ministry fund going on. And so without knowing what was going to happen, I called up the chairman of the board and said, we're willing to come. 2 weeks later, I get a call from a guy named Jeff Latour. He's the chairman of the board of the Strategic Resource Group. They've raised $150 million for Christian outreach in the Middle East. He said, we're so excited about what's going on in Pakistan with this ministry fund. Can we partner with you and take on the responsibility of raising all the US-based funds that you need? Wow, there's that problem solved right there. And not only that, now that they've agreed to do this, they've now raised $3 million for the next 3 years. And if you look at that graph going from 600,000 in the first year to 5 million a year in the fifth year, that number they plugged in for the next 2 years is right on that graph. That's not something I ever could have done. So here we have something that's a national movement that has started in Pakistan. The church is united in ways that is historically unprecedented. And it's a time when Muslims are more open to the gospel at any time. And I just sort of stand in awe of what God has done. And so people have come to me and says, how could we do this in Bangladesh and Nepal? And I says, I have no idea. I can tell you what we did, but I don't know how we did it. And we didn't do it. This was something that God did, but it required us being all in. And I wouldn't say God couldn't have done it, but he wouldn't have done it through us if we hadn't been all in. So yeah, we're moving back to Pakistan. And are we daunted? At times, yeah. I need to raise $46 million over the next 6 years. Not sure how we're going to do that. But what we've seen God do over the last 3 years gives us just extreme confidence that God's going to provide the resources and the people that we need to take that university forward. But God doesn't call everybody to start a nonprofit or to go to Pakistan. And so what does all this mean? What does it mean to be all in here in suburban America? Well, first of all, it really does take a willingness to respond to God's call and a willingness to shift our eyes from an exclusive focus on career success and financial and physical security. And it does take a willingness to hold what God has given you lightly. But I assure you that God's call here is no less noble or exciting than a call to go to Pakistan. And the mission of Grace Christian School actually is not that different from the mission of Foreman Christian College, to raise up the next generation of leaders as men and women who've given themselves to Christ, who are all in and who live with integrity and who've experienced God's grace. And the teachers and staff here at Grace Christian have responded to that call. And you can partner with them in many, many ways. Just don't do it by getting stuck in the doorway. Follow God's call and step into the life that he created you for and watch him accomplish his purposes in you and through you in ways that are beyond your imagination. So I invite you all tonight to be all in. Thank you.